Imagine you are driving home on a Tuesday night. You had exactly one glass of wine at dinner maybe an hour ago,
Right.
and you feel completely fine.
You are entirely sober by almost every cultural standard we have.
Exactly, you are entirely sober, but then you get pulled over for a broken taillight.
Yeah.
You do not slur your words, you don't stumble, you hand over your license perfectly.
Yeah, totally normal interaction.
Right. Yet within 48 hours, you have lost your commercial driving eligibility, your car insurance policy has been canceled, and you are facing thousands of dollars in administrative fees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And on top of that, you are staring down a mandatory ignition interlock installation for your dashboard. Welcome to the invisible edge of the zero point 0.05 blood alcohol concentration limit.
It is wild. And that scenario is the absolute epicenter of, probably the most significant shift in American traffic policy we have seen in a generation.
It really is.
We are looking at a fundamental redefinition of what it means to be a threat on the road. Basically, moving the legal threshold for drunk driving from the long-standing 0.08 down to 0.05.
And we are so glad you were joining us for this deep dive. Our mission today is to really pull apart the mechanics of this quiet but massive shift.
Yeah, we have a lot to get through.
We do. We have an extensive stack of sources to guide us today. We're looking at comprehensive policy analyses of the state-by-state legislative battles, granular physiological data on how alcohol interacts with the body at, microscopic level.
Yeah, the biology of it.
Exactly. Plus, incredibly detailed insurance risk modeling and a very close objective look at the data coming out of Utah, which was the first state to actually implement this.
And, to set the tone for you up front, this is an exercise in rigorous policy analysis.
Right.
We're looking at the friction between scientific measurement, public safety initiatives, and public tolerance.
Yeah.
This is not a moral referendum on drinking, nor is it, a public service announcement.
No, not at all. And I want you to keep a central premise in mind as we navigate these sources. This is kind of the narrative hook for everything we are going to unpack today. What happens when the law stops targeting the visibly drunk driver and starts targeting the confidently impaired one?
That is the big question.
Because to understand how a single glass of wine triggers that massive legal fallout we just talked about, we have to look at the biological reality of 0.05. Okay, let's unpack this. Because there is this persistent public misunderstanding that blood alcohol concentration is just like a fixed mathematical formula.
Oh, absolutely. People think, 0.08 is 3 drinks, so 0.05 must be 2.
Right.
But the physiological data we reviewed shatters that assumption completely. Blood alcohol concentration, the literal measure of how much alcohol is in your bloodstream, it depends on a biological equation with wildly variable inputs.
Yeah.
We were talking about body weight, biological sex, baseline metabolism, fatigue, medication, and the specific rate of consumption.
I was actually digging into the biological sex differences outlined in the research, and the mechanics of it are fascinating. It goes way beyond just body weight or water volume.
Yeah, it really does.
The sources highlight a specific enzyme in the stomach and liver called alcohol dehydrogenase, or ADH.
Right.
And this is the enzyme responsible for breaking down alcohol before it ever even reaches the bloodstream. Biologically, women generally produce significantly less active ADH in their stomachs than men do.
Which means if a man and a woman of the exact same weight consume the exact same drink at the exact same speed, the woman's body allows more unmetabolized alcohol to pass directly into the small intestine.
Oh.
Yeah, and then into the bloodstream. Her BAC spikes higher and faster simply due to that enzymatic production.
And the small intestine is like the superhighway for absorption. That actually brings in the food factor, which the sources emphasize heavily. We always hear, don't drink on an empty stomach, but the physiological why is what actually dictates your BAC. It has to do with the pyloric sphincter.
Right, which is the muscular valve connecting the stomach to the small intestine.
Exactly. When you drink on an empty stomach, that valve is open. The alcohol drops into the stomach and flushes almost immediately into the small intestine, leading to a massive, rapid spike in your blood alcohol level. So you can hit 0.05 incredibly fast.
But if you eat a meal, especially one with, proteins and fats, your stomach closes that pyloric sphincter to digest the food.
Okay.
The alcohol gets trapped in the stomach along with the meal. And because the stomach lining absorbs alcohol much, much slower than the small intestine, your BAC curve completely flattens out.
So you peak lower, but you stay elevated longer.
Exactly. And add to that biological variability the sheer unpredictability of the drinks themselves.
Oh, yeah.
The sources are quick to point out that a standard drink is a laboratory concept. It is not a real-world reality.
Right.
I mean, you order a mixed drink at a restaurant, you might get a standard 1.5-ounce pour. You order that same drink at a neighborhood bar, and a heavy-handed bartender pours 3 ounces of liquor into the glass.
Yeah, you think you've had one drink, but your liver is processing two. So the casual mental calculus of I only had one, I'm fine, is biologically and mathematically flawed.
Completely.
But that raises a really crucial question. What actually happens to the brain when you cross that 0.05 threshold? Because, like we said, you don't look drunk.
Right. What's fascinating here is the cognitive testing data from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. NHTSA rigorously tracks motor function at 0.05.
And what do they find?
At this level, impairment is entirely neurological. We see a statistically significant reduction in the ability to track moving objects, a loss of smooth steering control, and vastly reduced response times to emergency driving situations.
See, this is where we have to separate intoxication from impairment.
Yes.
Intoxication is the cultural stereotype, right?
Totally.
Slurring, stumbling, aggressive behavior.
Right.
But impairment is just a micro delay in processing information. It makes me think of playing a fast-paced video game on a television with a slight input lag.
Oh, that is a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
Mm.
The user experience versus the system reality.
Right, because if you are holding the controller, everything feels totally normal. You press the jump button exactly when you were supposed to.
Yeah.
But there is a 50 millisecond delay between your thumb hitting the button and the character on the screen reacting.
Exactly.
And if you are just walking your character down an empty hallway, you don't even notice the lag. It feels completely fine.
But the second an obstacle suddenly appears, the second you need to execute a split-second reaction, that invisible lag ruins you.
You hit the button, but the car crashes anyway. Because the processing time in the background was compromised. Driving at a 0.05 BAC operates on the exact same mechanism.
Right.
You are driving down an empty highway, holding the wheel, feeling awake and competent. Then the brake lights flash in front of you. Your eyes see them, but the neurological signal takes a fraction of a second longer to command your foot to hit the pedal.
And at 65 miles per hour, that fraction of a second covers dozens of feet.
Exactly.
And the psychological danger is the total lack of awareness of that input lag.
Right, because they don't feel it.
At 0.05, drivers rarely feel impaired. The sources explicitly highlight confidence as the primary risk factor. They speak clearly, they can walk a straight line, and they genuinely believe they are making a safe decision.
Yeah.
The law is attempting to address this invisible impairment before it becomes obvious intoxication.
Because that invisible impairment is what's causing accidents. But targeting something invisible requires redefining the boundaries of the law, which is an enormous hurdle.
Huge.
Up until recently, the nation basically operated on a unified consensus. Across most of the United States, 0.08 is the legal per se threshold.
Right. And in a courtroom, per se means the number itself is the proof. If a breathalyzer or blood draw confirms you are at or above 0.08, the law presumes you are legally intoxicated.
Okay.
Prosecuting a driver below 0.08 forces law enforcement to rely on subjective evidence, like field sobriety tests or erratic driving, which is much harder to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
Which effectively made 0.08 the safe harbor line for the public. But on December 30th, 2018, Utah became the first state to shatter that standard, lowering its per se threshold to 0.05. They fundamentally shifted the target from waiting for drivers to become clearly intoxicated to prosecuting them for being measurably impaired.
And the legislative intent in Utah wasn't to suddenly dragnet thousands of people who had a single beer at a barbecue.
Right.
The shift was rooted in deterrence. Lawmakers wanted to alter the psychological calculus of the driving public. When the line is 0.08, people try to game it. They mentally calculate their buffer zone.
Yeah, everyone does that mental math.
But if the line drops to 0.05, considering the biological variability we just discussed, the margin for error effectively vanishes. The behavioral warning becomes simply do not drunk and drive.
The theory of deterrence always sounds flawless in a State House committee room, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I read through the policy analyses of what actually happened in Utah, and I have to challenge the idea that this was a clean absolute victory. Before the law passed, critics warned it would devastate the state's hospitality industry and completely overwhelm the courts. Did it actually work, or did it just create chaos?
Well, the data coming out of Utah is some of the most fiercely debated policy material in our stack.
I can imagine.
If you look at the official NHTSA report analyzing 2019, which was the first full year the law was in effect, the numbers look like a resounding triumph. NHTSA reported a 19.8% drop in Utah's fatal crash rate and an 18.3% drop in the overall fatality rate compared to 2016.
Wow. A nearly 20% drop in fatal crashes is a staggering statistic.
It is.
For advocates of the .05 limit, that is the silver bullet, they point to Utah and say, look, the restaurants didn't go bankrupt, the courts didn't collapse, and we objectively saved lives. It looks like an open and shut case.
It does, until you bring in the counter-research.
All right.
The sources point to a highly critical 2026 analysis published on CrimRic. For context, CrimFrif is an open-access repository where top criminologists and data scientists share raw, peer-reviewed research.
Okay.
These are experts looking directly at the accident reports and statistical modeling, not pundits. And their analysis argued that Utah's law did not actually produce meaningful changes in alcohol-involved fatal crash measures.
I was looking at that CrimRIF study, and their methodology completely upends the NHTSA narrative.
Yeah, it does.
They point out that a drop in total fatalities is a fact, obviously, but the cause of that drop is highly speculative. They focus intensely on the failure to isolate variables.
Exactly. In complex systems like statewide traffic safety, isolating a single law is notoriously difficult. The criminologists noted that traffic fatalities are influenced by a massive web of concurrent factors.
Like what?
For instance, did the state simply increase highway patrol funding that year? Did policing patterns change to focus more heavily on specific high-risk corridors?
And the metric that stood out to me in the critique was vehicle miles traveled, or VMT.
Right.
If the economy shifts, or gas prices spike, or there's an increase in public transit use, total VMT drops. Fewer cars on the road naturally equate to fewer fatal crashes, completely independent of the BAC threshold.
Yep.
Furthermore, Utah was running massive statewide anti-drunk driving education campaigns simultaneously with the rollout of the law.
And when you have multi-million-dollar public awareness campaigns running alongside routine shifts in policing and macroeconomic factors, assigning the entirety of a 20% fatality drop to a .03 shift in the legal BAC limit is statistically perilous. Correlation does not equal causation.
So supporters use Utah as definitive proof that .05 saves lives, while skeptics use the exact same state to prove the data is hopelessly conflated.
Pretty much.
But regardless of who wins the statistical argument, Utah proved something much more dangerous to the status quo. They proved a .05 law could survive the political meat grinder.
Yeah, because before December 2018, .05 was essentially a white paper recommendation from public health academics.
Right.
Utah turned it into a functioning legislative model.
Okay.
And that transition from theory to reality is what ignited the state-by-state pressure campaign we are seeing right now.
And it is not a tidal wave sweeping the country, but rather a methodical, slow-burning push through individual state houses.
Right.
The current battlegrounds are Washington, New York, and Hawaii, and each one is approaching this friction entirely differently. Look at Washington state. A 2026 bill to lower the limit to .05 passed the state Senate, but ultimately failed to move forward in the House.
The stall in the Washington House is a perfect case study in resource allocation. The supporters brought the NHTSA data, focusing on the invisible impairment. But the critics countered with the reality of enforcement logistics.
Right, because if a state only has a set number of highway patrol troopers, and the courts only have a set number of prosecutors, expanding the legal net to catch people at .05 pulls resources away from targeting the worst offenders. The argument was, why are we spending hours processing a confidently impaired driver at .05 when we should be deploying those troopers to hunt down repeat offenders and high BA drivers blowing a .15?
And that debate over expanding the net versus targeting the extreme outliers is the primary roadblock in Western states. But if we shift to New York, the conversation is framed entirely around public health and international alignment, specifically tying .05 to Vision Zero.
Oh, Vision Zero is fascinating. It started in Sweden in the 1990s as this holistic philosophy that no loss of life on the roads is acceptable, and it has heavily influenced urban planning in places like New York City.
Right.
In that framework, .05 isn't just an isolated drunk driving penalty. It's integrated into lowering speed limits, redesigning intersections, and viewing traffic fatalities as a solvable public health crisis rather than inevitable accidents.
Yeah.
Proponents in New York also lean heavily on international standards, pointing out that across much of Europe, .05 is the accepted norm.
But New York also faces an incredibly fierce, entrenched opposition. You have the hospitality industry, a massive nightlife economy, and significant tourism.
Oh, absolutely.
The economic argument is that dropping the limit will terrify patrons into staying home. More importantly, civil liberties advocates in New York are highly organized against this.
And the civil liberties aspect is crucial because if impairment at point zero 0.05 is virtually invisible, how does an officer establish probable cause to make a stop?
Right.
The fear is that lowering the threshold gives law enforcement an overly broad mandate to pull people over based on the slimmest of pretexts, opening the door to profiling and over-policing in marginalized communities.
Exactly. Hawaii, however, bypasses the enforcement logistics entirely and aims for a complete philosophical reset.
Here's where it gets really interesting, actually.
Yeah.
The sources highlight that advocates in Hawaii aren't just trying to catch more people, they're trying to dismantle the cultural norm of social drinking and driving.
They want to completely eliminate the buffer. The advocates in Hawaii are saying that as long as the limit is .08, people will do the mental math.
Right, they'll try to game it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By dropping it to .05, the public messaging changes from figure out how close you are to the legal limit to just do not drive.
It is an attempt to enforce a behavioral absolute.
Yeah.
But, the fundamental clash across Washington, New York, and Hawaii is the friction between scientific measurement and public tolerance.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the fundamental clash really is between science and public opinion. The lab proves impairment happens before .08.
Great.
But the political reality is that a vast portion of the voting public fundamentally believes having one or two drinks with dinner does not instantly transform them into a criminal threat.
It's one thing for states like Hawaii to push this as a philosophical shift, but the reality on the ground is that this philosophy is backed by a sprawling multi-billion-dollar enforcement industry.
Oh, yeah.
The moment a driver hits .05, they aren't just crossing a moral line. They're stepping onto an economic conveyor belt.
The sources refer to this as the architecture of enforcement. We tend to view a DUI as a private interaction between a driver and a police officer.
Yeah, just a ticket or an arrest.
But in truth, a DUI system is a massive, interconnected network. An arrest feeds the courts, the prosecutors, and defense lawyers. It feeds probation offices, state licensing agencies, mandated treatment providers, and technology vendors.
And one of the most cynical yet vital insights from our reading is the concept that policy creates markets.
Right.
While public safety groups are absolutely pushing for .05 to save lives, and, NHTSA's statistic of 11,904 drunk driving deaths in 2024 is a tragedy we cannot ignore.
Of course.
But we have to recognize the economics. Expanding the legal gray zone inherently expands the client base for mandatory services.
This raises an important question, though, about the uncomfortable reality of enforcement. Take the ignition interlock industry as a prime example. These are the breathalyzer devices hardwired into a vehicle's dashboard, requiring a clean breath sample before the engine will start.
Right.
The interlock market is massive, and it relies on legislative mandates. Lobbyists for these technology vendors are highly active in state houses because a Bureau .05 law means thousands of new drivers will be forced by the courts to lease their equipment, pay monthly calibration fees, and fund a continuous revenue stream.
Wow. And the same economic expansion applies to the mandated treatment programs, right?
Yep.
A conviction almost always requires alcohol assessments and weeks of state-approved education classes, all paid for out of pocket by the driver. The public debate focuses on safety, but the procedural reality is a massive transfer of wealth from the driver to this sprawling enforcement ecosystem.
And the administrative fees and court costs are just the initial shock. The true devastation, the long tail of a .05 conviction, revolves almost entirely around insurance risk modeling.
So what does this all mean? This is where we bring it directly to your wallet. Insurance underwriting for a DUI isn't a judgment on your moral character.
No, it's just math.
It makes me think of a casino identifying a card counter at a blackjack table. The pit boss doesn't care if the card counter is a nice person or if they only made a small bet.
Right.
The player has triggered a mathematical algorithm that indicates they are a liability, and the casino instantly changes the odds against them.
Insurers operate on the exact same ruthless math. They do not care if you felt fine at .05 or if you were pulled over for a broken taillight rather than swerving. A conviction tells their risk models that you have crossed a behavioral line associated with severe loss exposure. You are instantly reclassified as a high-risk driver.
I was looking at the data from major insurers to see exactly how this plays out. Progressive points out that the rate impacts are universally severe in the first few years, easily doubling or tripling your premium because a recent violation signals a high immediate risk of a repeat offense.
Wow.
And Allstate notes that depending on the state, a DUI remains an active weight on your risk profile for 3 to 10 years.
And it goes deeper than just premium hikes. Many states require a convicted driver to carry an SR-22 or an FR-44.
What are those?
These are essentially certificates of financial responsibility filed directly by your insurance carrier to the State Department of Motor Vehicles. It proves you carry minimum liability coverage.
And the mechanics of an SR-22 are brutal. If you miss a single payment on your insurance, the carrier is legally obligated to immediately notify the state, which automatically suspends your driver's license.
Oh, wow.
You are essentially paying your insurance company to act as your probation officer. Furthermore, asking an insurer to file an SR-22 instantly flags you to every underwriter in their system as a high-risk liability, leading many carriers to simply non-renew your policy altogether.
And the professional consequences are equally severe. A .05 conviction will immediately strip a driver of a commercial driver's license, ending careers in trucking or logistics.
Right.
It triggers automatic deactivation from rideshare platforms like Uber or Lyft. It flags on background checks for security clearances and impacts any profession that requires driving a company vehicle.
So you could be out at dinner, meticulously calculating the hours since your last drink, thinking the only question you have to answer is, am I going to get arrested?
Yeah.
But the far more consequential question is, what happens to my life if I am convicted?
The margin for error shrinks to absolute zero. You are betting thousands of dollars in legal fees, years of exorbitant insurance premiums, and your professional livelihood on your subjective ability to guess your internal gastric emptying rate and enzymatic production.
Which is exactly why the sources conclude that the cleanest insurance advice is identical to the simplest legal advice. If you are drinking anything, do not build your night around staying barely legal. Build it around not driving at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us to the current state of play.
Yeah.
As we record this, .08 remains the national standard across the vast majority of the country. If you were pulled over in most states tonight, that is still the line for, per se, impairment.
But the ground is actively shifting. The Utah precedent exists, and the data, despite the criminologists' warnings, is being used aggressively as a template.
Yes, it is.
So the methodical pressure campaign in states like Washington, New York, and Hawaii is not stopping. They are testing the political resistance, refining their public health arguments, and waiting for the right legislative windows.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've dissected today.
Okay.
If .05 does eventually become the new national norm, and the physiological margin for error is truly as unpredictable as the science shows, it threatens to entirely eradicate the cultural concept of social drinking and driving.
Yeah, because for decades, American social life has relied on the idea of the designated driver. You know, the person who maybe nurses a single beer over the course of 3 hours and is deemed the safest person to drive everyone home. The core question has always been, who is the most sober?
We may be rapidly approaching a future where that question is completely obsolete. If the legal and financial risks of a .05 threshold are too catastrophic to gamble on, we are moving toward an absolute zero-tolerance reality.
Wow.
The designated driver simply will not be able to consume a single drop of alcohol. It represents a total paradigm shift in how we navigate public life and personal responsibility.
A complete paradigm shift. From the undeniable, objective clarity of a radar gun catching a speeder, to the highly variable, microscopic, and invisible biological reality of .05, the line between a safe citizen and a criminal liability is being radically redrawn.
It really is.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. As always, we encourage you to look closely at the data, understand the mechanisms behind the headlines, and keep questioning the policies that shape your daily life.